Hey there, my name's Curtis Lucas and you're watching Empire Building. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about something that's been on my mind for quite some time and I haven't really addressed it. And that's to do with the situation up here in Canada that has become widely known around the world that we're dealing with and that has been evolving with the trucker convoy and protest and blockades. And the enactment of the Emergencies Act by Justin Trudeau's government. There is a lot to unpack here. This is a deeply complicated subject. And I thought it was time to do a video of my own about this because, frankly, what I've been seeing on social media as well as the mainstream media, generally speaking, just about everybody has missed the mark on this. I think that I have a unique perspective on this because I have a family who live in Ottawa. Most of my wife's family lives and works in that city, and they've been dealing with the realities of this occupation slash protest that's been going on for the last month or so. But I am also a stark orange-blooded Bitcoiner, and I believe that there are certain rights that individuals should be able to maintain over their own sovereignty, over their own wealth. And what we've seen here is a violation of that. As I mentioned, this is a very complicated issue, so I'm going to do my best to present the facts. Now, I realize that a vast majority of my viewers are in the United States, so depending on your news outlet of choice or the echo chambers you might find yourself in, the reality of what's actually going on over here may not be as clear as you think. And that goes for people in Canada as well. But regardless, this is becoming a worldwide issue, and this movement has grown roots in many countries around the world. The United States currently has its own Freedom Convoy currently making its way to Washington. For the time being, I'm going to focus on what's actually happened here and is still happening. For starters, by now, no matter what side you find yourself on, you have to acknowledge that there has been a large amount of bias already formed, and it started right at the beginning. And one of the major culprits of this was Justin Trudeau. The first thing he said about these as he called fringe minorities that held unacceptable views, the first thing that he did was to demonize them. The reality is, in any protest group, if you want to, you can single out any of the bad actors and use that in an attempt to discredit the entire group. This was wrong when Donald Trump did it, and it's wrong now. Unfortunately, yet again, this is one of those things that just adds fuel to the fire and leads to further division. I myself am double vaccinated. I have no problem following mask mandates. But I also acknowledge that the mandates don't affect us all evenly. Yes, we all have to make sacrifices, but some of us make greater sacrifices than others. So it's unfair to say that we are all in this together. That was never true, and by now at least most of us understand this. So while I understand that it's easy to demonize and criticize someone who believes that the vaccine is just some sort of a government ploy to brainwash all of us, obviously this is not the case, but that's not the point here. The point here is that we have a large percentage of the Canadian population who had a legitimate grievance, and rather than listening to them, the Prime Minister chose to further divide the nation. As far as I'm concerned, this was a situation that could have been very quickly dealt with, provided he could at least recognize that he may have gone a little bit too far. Reflect on that and actually try to bring the country back together again. But he leaned into this. Now, the truckers themselves are not without fault here. The reality is, what many people may not realize is that for 10 minutes, every half hour, in the early days of the protest, they would sound their horns for 10 minutes straight. and then do it again in a half an hour, all night long. So you can imagine if you're a resident that lives anywhere in the vicinity of downtown, which is a significant number of people, some of which may actually support your views, but it's going to be pretty hard to win over those hearts and minds when you're depriving them of sleep.
Then it stops when the government lifts the mandates.
You idiot! The mandates are provincial!
Sleep deprivation is a form of torture, a legitimate form of torture. So yes, while this technically amounts to a bylaw infraction, done at this scale, it's something else altogether. As I mentioned, I have family who live in the city of Ottawa who were directly impacted by this, and it was stressful and agonizing, to say the least. And that brings me to some of the failings of this group, because I don't believe that their messaging was racist or misogynist or consistent with Nazis and swastikas. While Trudeau was spreading that message that this group was a hate group, what he failed to acknowledge was that the symbolism, the Nazi symbolism that was used by a very small percentage of this group, were using it in the context of trying to warn others what this country could become. Not that they were Nazis themselves. Now, having said that, utilizing that kind of symbolism is essentially taboo, and the vast majority of people would agree that that kind of messaging should be off limits. Now, I'm not here to argue that point one way or the other, but I do think that context is important if you're going to judge this group based on that and that alone. Now, the other problem here was that the early organizers of this campaign were found to hold some pretty severe white supremacist views.
That's what the goal is to depopulate the Anglo-Saxon race, because they are the ones with the strongest bloodlines.
So, of course, on the liberal media side of things, they leaned in on this hard in a rather successful attempt at discrediting the group as a whole, among other things. But again, despite the fact that this may have started through these people, doesn't necessarily reflect on the entire group as a whole. There were many minorities, visible minorities, that were a part of this movement as well. And many other people latched on, not based on the original founders' white supremacist views. Many of them didn't even know that that was even a thing. They came for their own reasons. And this lack of a cohesive message made it more difficult for people to really understand what their goals were. But nevertheless, things took a turn for the worse when the blockade started to take place, when a lot of these truckers parked themselves on critical arteries and border crossings, stopping all movement of goods between Canada and the United States. This definitely got people's attention, and it was a notable escalation in the tactics that were being used. And the response came very quickly after. Up until this point, Trudeau had basically ignored them, hoping that they would maybe go away, and continued to demonize them and try to discredit them. But at this point, he reached right for the hammer and enacted Canada's Emergencies Act, which was actually a successor to the War Measures Act. This was a piece of legislation that gives the government sweeping new powers that allow them to act without the need for due process or going through the courts. Obviously, based off its former name, this was reserved for periods of war. Before the name was changed, the War Measures Act was only ever used 3 times. Once for World War I, again for World War II, and the third time was the only time it was ever used during peace times to deal with a serious situation in Quebec that involved basically domestic terrorists, kidnappings, murders. It was a pretty significant issue. Coincidentally, enacted by Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau. And even at that time, it was widely criticized as government overreach. So Justin Trudeau apparently took a page out of his father's playbook and did it again. Needless to say, this was shocking to many, especially in the Bitcoin community, because the first thing that they did with these new powers was instruct the banks and the RCMP to work together to identify anyone who is participating in these protests and anyone that has assisted them through financial means at any point, and they could use these powers to freeze their assets without court orders, without due process, with no recourse whatsoever. They could also suspend the licenses and insurance for any trucker companies that were found to be participating in the blockades or the protests. Tonight in Canada's Parliament, the House of Representatives met to ratify the use or the enactment of the Emergencies Act. And despite Trudeau not holding a majority government, with the help of the NDP party, that passed.
It's a propose that the Senate give immediately emergency powers to the Supreme Chancellor.
Now, I know it may seem funny that I'm using a clip from Star Wars to draw comparisons here, but what I find is that especially in these events that have unfolded, anyone that chooses to use events from our own history is basically going to get criticized for belittling those very real tragedies that have occurred in our past. And it is disrespectful to the survivors and the people who have suffered losses as a result of those events in our history, for them to be used for political messaging of any kind. So I feel, at least in this way, the point of the message shouldn't be lost. And the point of the message is, when governments reach for power, it first has to be given to them. Someone has to give it to them. They can't just take it on their own, not from a democratic society. And here's the biggest problem. It's not that Trudeau is secretly some kind of fascist government. His problem is that he believes his intentions are good. He believes that he will use this power responsibly. And for those of you who don't know, in Canada, we don't just have two major parties. We actually have, well, depending on how you look at it, at least four. In this case, the Liberals and the NDP parties voted in support, and the Conservatives and the Bloc Québécois voted against. But as you can see, when you're trying to look at this from a balanced point of view, you find yourself stuck in the middle of a very complicated situation. But it's only complicated because it was made to be complicated. This situation never had to get to where it is now in the first place. That's the point. And now that it is here, we have a person in power that's grabbing for more power because he's faced with a group that he disagrees with. And he has just set a precedent that cannot be undone. This is what I don't think he understands. He thinks that his intentions are good. He believes that he will willingly relinquish this power that he has taken.
As soon as these measures are no longer required, we will gladly lift them. This is responsible leadership.
I love democracy. I love the Republic. The power you give me, I will lay down when this crisis has abated.
There it is again. I was really hoping that our multi-party platform here in Canada was going to protect us from situations like this. But I realized that when met with enough fear, people will give up a lot, and without realizing the precedent that they're setting. Tonight on Twitter, what's actually trending right now, more than anything about this issue, is the hashtag Trudeau was right. And when you spend some time looking through those comments, you realize a lot of people believe that what he did was brave and necessary. And I'm sure that he will relinquish this power in due course. And our democracy is still strong enough to withstand this. However, what will he do the next time a group he disagrees with makes things difficult for him? Or what about an entirely different government altogether? What happens when one day someone like Vladimir Putin manages to get himself elected in this country? Someone who knows how to wage psychological warfare on its own citizens, which, let's be frank, is exactly what Justin Trudeau was doing. But someone with more nefarious intentions. By setting this precedent, you make it easier one day for that real tyrant to gain a foothold, because it's going to be very hard to deny someone in the future taking this course of action when you yourself did it. No one is going to take you seriously when you condemn someone from doing the exact same thing that you did. I was hoping that our elected officials would be able to identify this for what it is. Taking a Canadian citizen's personal wealth and turning it against them as a weapon because you disagree with their political views should never be allowed. And I'm ashamed that there's even a legal mechanism for them to do this. And it highlights the incredible importance of Bitcoin in our future to protect us from our own governments. And again, this has nothing to do with the issue at hand, whether you are for mandates or against them. This has everything to do with the fact that this is even possible. These measures even targeted cryptocurrency exchanges and forced those exchanges to turn over any information with regards to funding that may have come from identified wallets that they blacklisted. So if any transactions were to be sent to any of these exchanges from these wallets, those exchanges must immediately seize those assets. The CEO of Kraken came out and publicly said, if this worries you, get your money, get your coins off any public exchange or centralized exchange and only trade peer-to-peer. It does beg the question, what is going to happen when governments truly feel threatened by this technology? What sort of psychological warfare will they engage in? My hope is that by the time anything like that might happen, the adoption of Bitcoin would have reached the level where there would be so many people within those borders already using this technology that they will fight to defend it. And I don't mean fight in the sense of violence. The reality is, what we've seen from all of this is that these governments will go to those extreme means and try to target their own citizens, like I said, using their own wealth as a weapon against them. When enough of us opt out of that system, when they try to do that in the future, it won't matter if they clamp down on exchanges. If you were a trucker and all your wealth was in Bitcoin, provided there was enough other people willing to accept that as payment for goods and services, then nobody could stop you. They would have to turn us all into criminals. And this is why the game theory behind Bitcoin is so important. The only way we can protect ourselves from that outcome is if we've reached enough scale that when they engage in those activities, we will have other means to circumvent them. You would still be able to buy your groceries. You would still be able to make even your mortgage payment, because maybe your mortgage isn't through a traditional lender. Maybe your mortgage is through a DeFi smart contract. My only fear is that we may not reach that point soon enough. There's going to be some kind of a battle, I think, before that happens. But like I said, this is a situation that transcends borders. So if one country does choose to crack down using measures like this that we're seeing here in Canada today, then how many people will choose to simply leave and go somewhere else? Say El Salvador or other places that are just not so oppressive. But the worst thing that could happen, and is probably the most likely scenario that we have to fear, is where the public willingly gives up their freedoms because they're afraid enough and they're unable to see the threat that's standing right in front of them.
For a safe and secure society.
So this is how liberty dies. With thunderous applause.
I know it can sound like a crazy conspiracy theory today, but even if Justin Trudeau is not that threat, it doesn't mean there isn't someone in our future who could be. And this just made it easier for them. That's all for this one. Now let's get back to empire building.